think if you look at, the world as a whole and like the way all the other technological trends are going, like, in-person surveillance is just going up every year, right?
Yeah.
Like if you commit a crime in, meat space, it's getting harder and harder to get away with it. So like, if you wants to do something, and this is something that's just like happening as a result of, just better technology information transparency. Like a lot of it's hard to prevent even if you really tried. So the world where like things go dark to such an as the police hawks sometimes like to say, to such an extent that like, oh my God, the criminals are committing crimes with impunity and we can't see anything. Like that just seems unlikely.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, like the world uh, where there just you know is no privacy, for example, or the world where there just like is no ability to kind of act outside of the confines of mainstream institutions, like some that's something that's more realistic, and that seems like something that could lead to a lot of a lot of scary things, right? And like even from a government's point of view, right? Like I think governments over the last few years, a lot of them, they're very worried about sovereignty. They're worried about like if their countries, economies, and social environments are just completely dependent on basically foreign tech companies controlled by foreign governments. Like governments are not on team government, right? It's like the Indian government is on team India, the Russian government is on team Russia, and so forth, right? So like they don't want the U.S. to be able to like have this big backdoor into everything. So I mean, I do think that a balance is needed, but at the same time, I do think I guess I definitely like worry more about the possibility that just like without things like crypto kind of acting outside of institutions becomes too impossible, and I don't even necessarily mean outside of governments, even just outside of corporations, like becomes too impossible, and there's just like terrible things that come as a result. And if things going in the other direction, like it obviously is a risk, but at the same time, I think in the long term, like a crypto can potentially even like offer defenses as much as attacks against that sort of thing.
Yeah, throughout history, many of the most destructive things came from centralized institutions versus sort of from the people operating in the shadows. And I've been talking to a bunch of psychedelics folks, the people doing researchers like Rick Doblin in Johns Hopkins. There's a lot of exciting research on psychedelics. And one thing you could say about operating at the edge of legality, it could actually accelerate the adoption of particular things, like whether it's marijuana or psychedelics that can help people out. It almost accelerates the policy. It forces the policy to catch up to where the people stand.
Right.
So there's a positive way of doing things that are in the gray area of legality and creating a market that allows people to in a safe way be able to participate in this gray area of legality.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that the set of like the kinds of things that just like payment processors as companies try to restrict you from is much larger than the set of things that's illegal, right?
Right.
Like part of that is because they want to be super conservative, and like the more layers you have, the more they're like conservative because they're scared of what the layer below them will do to them. Sometimes they have their own, moral opinions of various kinds. Like, they go after lots of people, right? Like they make life really hard for, like sex workers, for example. Like, psychedelics, as you mentioned. There's a lot of activity, even including stuff that is totally legal. That just, there's this like, shadow like PayPal credit card government or whatever you want to call it, and that makes it just hard to participate in this stuff. So I think like reducing the number of intermediaries is definitely normally a good thing.
All right, let's talk about one of the most exciting technologies, like technically, philosophically, like socially, financially, in every way, which is Ethereum 2.0. There's a million things to talk about, but at the step one is probably a good thing to do, which is Can you briefly summarize your vision,
Mhm.
how Ethereum 2.0 will make Ethereum more scalable, secure, and sustainable?
Sure. So I think recently we've actually been kind of de-emphasizing the ETH 2.0 branding, I guess.
Hmm.
So the reason behind that was that originally we envisioned something more like a big grand event where, all the good things would happen at the same time, and
Yeah.
it would be a new blockchain, and it would be a new protocol, and people would have to take a lot of effort to migrate over. But later we've slowly changed the roadmap over to something that's much more incremental. Right. So, proof of stake happens kind of over time, and then sharding gets added over time, and all these features get added over time. And so the experience for just a regular Ethereum user still feels very seamless, right? It's like maybe a little bit more complex than the hard forks that we've already done, but from a user's point of view, but like not by that much, right? So the big two things that are happening, right? These are what used to be considered the two flagship features of ETH 2.0, and now they're just, the flagship features of the next evolution of Ethereum,
Yes.
as proof of stake and sharding. Right. So proof of stake is a consensus algorithm. It's or consensus mechanism, I should say. It's the difference is that like an algorithm is something that you run by yourself. A mechanism is like it involves like interactions between people, and it could even include incentives and all of that. So a consensus mechanism, so by which nodes in the network agree on, which blocks came in, which transactions came in what order, make sure that once a block gets accepted, it can't get reverted, and all of these things that we expect from a blockchain. So existing blockchains, including Bitcoin, including the Ethereum of today, and including a lot of them, they use proof of work, right? So the reason why we need proof of anything is because like they serve this function that I call kind of economic Sybil resistance. So that's obviously a big word for, especially if you've never heard of Sybils before. But like the basic idea is right that you have a network and you have lots of computers that agree on like which block to accept,
Mhm.
and sometimes you get two blocks that get published at the same time, and you just have to agree on an order. So there has to be some kind of voting game. Yeah, but then the question is, well, in this voting game, who gets a vote, who gets to participate? Now, you can't say one person, one vote, right? The reason why you cannot say one person, one vote is because you need some kind of like authority or some kind of mechanism to say, who the humans are, like, and if you don't have that, then a bad guy could just come in with a virtual machine or with a computer that has on it 10 billion virtual machines that have 10 billion, virtual nodes, and then just like say, look, I'm 99% of the network. I should control everything.
Mhm.
So to prevent this, what proof of work and proof of stake both do is they basically say, well, the weight of your vote, like how much influence your votes have in the consensus, is proportional to like what quantity of economic resources you bring in. So in the case of proof of work, you prove what economic resources you have because your economic resources are computers, and you prove that you have them by just running them 24/7 using these hash algorithms, right? So this does solve the problem, right? Because in order to attack the network, you have to come in with more computers and like more money invested into computers and electricity than the rest of the network put together, and that's extremely expensive. In proof of stake, instead of relying on people with computers that are just constantly cranking out hashes 24/7, as your like unit of economic resources, you just use like holdings of coins inside the system, right? So all of these blockchains, they have some kind of coin in them. Bitcoin has Bitcoin, Ethereum has Ether. They all have a coin. So why not just use that as the economic resource that you're using to like measure participation? So that's like the core distinction between proof of work and proof of stake. I like proof of stake, and I've liked proof of stake for many years, basically because like it just requires much less ongoing resource consumption. Right, like with proof of work, you have to like actually go and buy these physical computers, and these days, yeah, they have specialized hardware, ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits. You have to go produce them, you have to go buy them, and unless you have millions of dollars, you have to buy them from one of these other people who creates them, and those other people often end up taking a huge cut of the profits themselves. And then you have to plug them in. You have to just burn all of this electricity that's just running 24/7. So it consumes a huge amount of energy, right? And not just energy. It also, just to create the hardware, right? Like people focus a lot on energy, but like actually about half the cost of proof of work mining is the cost of the hardware. So hardware is a very big deal too. And you need this really big and powerful, like very specialized hardware, the kind that fills up these big warehouses. So proof of stake, you don't really need that much electricity. You just need just a little bit to run a regular computer. You can run proof of stake validators on computers that you already have. So it's just much less resource intensive. And like this is good for a few reasons, right? Like one is the kind of environmental rationale that you're not breaking the environment. The second is that you're not taking away electricity and like other resources from other people, right? Like right now, I think just today I saw a story about like Iran wanting to shut down some Bitcoin mining because it was just grabbing up so much electricity that it was outbidding the nearby towns, and they just didn't have enough. And then there is like Chia, the one that's doing proof of like hard disk mining, basically is just like grabbing up so many hard disks that there's a shortage, right? So that's the second reason. And then the third, more selfish reason is that because participating in consensus does not require so much energy expenditure, you don't need to pay people as much to participate, right? So like Bitcoin and Ethereum, they both issue somewhere around 4% of the total supply every year right now to miners. So Ethereum is about 4.7 million Ether, and the current supply is about 115 million. But with proof of stake, like we expect it'll be somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million per year. So that means the supply doesn't have to increase so quickly. So
one of the pros that
mhm.
that people sort of argue for the proof of work is
Mhm.
that it is secure because it's much more difficult to sort of,
Hmm.
as you've highlighted, it's difficult to participate. Is there what are your thoughts about the security
Mhm.
of the proof of stake
Hmm.
mechanism?
Yeah.
Is there ways to make it secure?
So I think proof of stake is very secure because in order to be able to attack the system, you need to have like basically as much stake as the rest of the network, right? So that means like right now, for example, we have 5 million ETH staking. So you have to come up with 5 million ETH and then join the network. And then the other so 5 million ETH is a lot, right? It's like how much is it now? Like $15 billion. So that's actually more than I believe the cost of attacking the Bitcoin network. And then the second thing is that recovering from attacks is much easier in proof of stake than in proof of work, right? Because in proof of stake, you have, like, first of all, we have for many kinds of attacks that you do against this network, we have this concept of like automatic slashing, right? Which basically means that in order to like revert a finalized block. So if there's one block that's like accepted by the network and you try to convince the network to kind of revert that block and accept a different block, in order to make that kind of attack, you basically have to have your validator, like a big portion of your validators, sign two conflicting messages. And this is something that, like, once these messages are on the network, like, you can go and prove, like, look, these people did it. And so we have this feature in the protocol called slashing, where you basically take all these people who provably misbehaved and you burn their coins, right? And you don't burn anyone else's coins. Now, there are other cases, like, for example, if instead of reverting blocks, the attack just tries to censor everyone, right? Then what you do, everyone who got censored would just like basically create the minority chain, and then the community would basically have to do a soft fork, right? They would just have to say like, look, this chain is clearly attacking us. This chain is the one not attacking us, and so we're going to join this chain. And then what happens is that on that new chain, the attackers also lose a lot of coins. Right.
Yeah.
So the difference between proof of stake and proof of work is that in a proof of stake system, like you can identify specific participants and you can say, these, and like this isn't like, a human going in and saying, I don't like you, I don't like you, I don't like you. This is like automated, right? You can
So the slashing process is automated.
Yes.
Is there ways it can go wrong? So that's a painful process where the coins are burned.
It is painful, yes. I think, the one big unknown, of course, is like if an attack actually happens, and like if an attack happens that requires the community to actually choose one of these minority forks, then like what would the community actually successfully coordinating on this look like, right? Like it's like we can talk about it and we can, write like science fiction novels about it, but like until it's happened, you don't really know the details of like what it looks like and how difficult it is.
What are the channels of communication for the community? If you can enlighten me a little bit, like what,
Mm.
you know,
Hmm.
in many ways in the political realm,
Hmm.
Twitter is often used as a way to kind of have these emergent phenomena of
Hmm.
large groups of people coming to a consensus
Right.
about a particular idea. And
Hmm.
then there's battle for consensus. What's
Hmm.
in the Ethereum community,
Hmm.
how do people, what are the sources of natural language based communication that have an emergent belief structure that you would
Hmm.
say? Or is it all
So
through money? Is it all through trading that the
no, I think
communication happens?
there's definitely talking as well. I mean, like we have to agree on protocol changes somehow, right? Like there's Twitter, there's Reddit, there's GitHub, there's all of the various Ethereum forums, Ethereum magicians, Ethereum research. There's just in-person communication. Then there's just kind of like the hidden web of everyone talking to everyone on Telegram,
Yeah.
or Signal. So it's like some of everything, right? But I think like the thing to emphasize around like can you actually come to consensus on whether or not to fork the chain because the attacker is censoring everyone, just for example, is like everyone who's running a node is going to see almost the same thing, right? Like they're going to be off by a few seconds, and like maybe they'll be off by a few minutes. They'll disagree by a few minutes, but like if it's a serious attack, people are going to know, right? It's not like one of those things where, we're trying to agree on like, I don't know, did Epstein kill himself or like some, random
Yeah.
political fact where like in
Yeah.
reality, no one knows a single thing about what's
Yeah.
actually going on and they're all speculating. Like it is much more visible, right? So we do have that, but at the same time, I'm happy to admit that like these are fairly untested mechanisms.
Mhm.
But like at the same time, they're also untested mechanisms in proof of work, right? And like in proof of work, it's even harder because in proof of work, you don't have the ability to like identify and say, like, I'm going to these miners attacked, and so we're not going to let these miners in. These miners did not attack, so we're going to keep them in. Like you have to pretty much, either take out none of the miners, or you do a fork that changes the proof of work algorithm, which takes out all of the miners, right? So the economics of like recovering from attacks in proof of work, at least to me, actually do seem like more unfavorable. But I'm sure the proof of work people you talk to will give very different and contradictory opinions, and that's totally fine and amazing.
Some people describe MEV,
Mm.
minor extractable value, as an existential risk to Ethereum.
Mm.
What is MEV? How important is it to solve MEV? If it's important, what ideas do you have?
Sure. How about after this one, we'll also talk about sharding because it's
Yes.
amazing and it's part of
We'll
ETH too.
return back to sharding and
Excellent. No, and
we'll return to the big picture of the scaling problem, as you mentioned.
I love this conversation. Depth first search instead of breadth first. So basically, okay, MEV, minor extractable value. It is not different in proof of work and proof of stake, right? So like if you want to call it, block proposer extractable value, like it sounds less sexy, but we can call it BPEV instead of MEV. Who cares? But the
So this is
base,
a problem in both proof of work and proof of stake.
yes. So the basic idea is that if you have the ability to choose which transactions go into a block and in what order, then you have the ability to like take advantage of that position for economic gain in a lot more ways than just collecting transaction fees, right?
Mhm.
Like for example, there's decentralized exchanges on chain like Uniswap. And like let's say the price of ETH versus USDC was 2700 the previous block, but then there was a bit of a market drop and now it's 2680, where you can go on Uniswap and you can just like gobble up the entire part of the automated order book that's like between 2700 and 2680, right? And then at the same time you like run a bot and you buy some ETH back at 2680 and you've just like made about $10 of profit, right? So or well, $10 times whatever the depth is, right? So there's lots of little things like that. There's also things that involve like front running other people's transactions. So one example of this would be that if someone sends a transaction that says like, I don't know, buy me 5 ETH for whatever price that you can get, but with a maximum of let's say $15,000, then you can go and like you can put a transaction right in front of that transaction, and you can like buy up that ETH first, and then you resell it to him at $15,000 minus one. So
And then you
there's
get to make a little bit of money that way.
exactly. So there's a lot of these different like arbitrage, front running, back running, these different tricks that allow block proposers to
To get some percentage on top, like overhead.
exactly.
Okay.
And
So
the reason why this is a challenge is because I mean, like first of all, it sometimes degrades user experience because users get less favorable trades. But there are sometimes ways to like mitigate that for applications. Sometimes it's not that bad. But like the bigger risk that I think some people consider more existential is that there's just much more economies of scale in figuring out how to extract all this revenue. Right? Because if you're just collecting transaction fees, there aren't really economies of scale. There aren't really benefits to centralizing, right? Because it's a very simple formula. You just like grab up the transactions that pay you the most. But with MEV, there's all these sophisticated algorithms, and if you have lots of money, then you can hire really smart people to make amazing algorithms, and then you can use the other half of your money to get a lot of mining power or a lot of stake, and you get a lot of opportunities to use your even better algorithms. So there's this risk that, like, as a result of this, mining is basically, or even validating proof of stake is going to centralize. So I think the ecosystem's best reply to this sort of risk, and it's the direction where projects like Flashbots are going already, is if you can't eliminate the centralization, then you try to firewall it, right? And the way that you firewall it is you basically say, we're going to try to deliberately create a marketplace where people can just do the complicated work of creating what are called bundles, like bundles of transactions that like are very profitable, right? And then at the other side of the market, you just have like block proposers reminders that are just dumb nodes, and they go and ask the what are called searchers, the bundle creators, and they just ask like, hey, like how much can you give me if I put in your bundle? And then they just take the highest offer, right? So you sort of separate out the task, and you have the easy part, and then you have the hard part, and you have like this special class of actor called a searcher that does the hard part, and then the easy part, the people doing the easy part, which is just miners and validators, they kind of just talk to all the different people doing the searching, and they just accept the highest bidder, right? So, and this is also just like an interesting example of like economic design philosophy, right? Like sometimes you can't just like make centralization go away. Sometimes it's inevitable, but at least you can try to kind of contain it. You can direct it, or you can even sort of firewall it away from core consensus, the parts that really do need to be decentralized. So,
but you don't see it as an existential risk. It's just a little. It's a bit of a problem that has to be constantly dealt with.
It's a risk. Like there's obviously a risk that it's a very severe problem, and that even this Flashbots approach has some fatal flaw or whatever. Yeah. But I'm definitely like, we're definitely approaching it with the mindset of this is a problem, and like yes, we do have to do some work to solve it, but we're doing it, and so far it's being solved.
Okay, let's talk about the other really, really fascinating part of the future of Ethereum. Let's not call it Ethereum 2.0, but the future of Ethereum that also may require a hard fork. I don't know. You can correct me on this. Is, well, broadly ideas for scaling.
Yes.
And more specifically, sort of layer 2 or layer 1 and 2 intersection ideas of how to achieve scaling. And at the core of that is the idea of sharding. So first, what is sharding?
Okay. So there's two major paradigms for scaling blockchains, right? As you said, layer 1 and layer 2. And layer 1 basically means make the blockchain itself like capable of processing more transactions by having some mechanism by which it can do that, despite the fact that there's a limit to the capacity of each participant in the blockchain. And then layer 2 says, well, we're going to keep the blockchain as is, but we're going to create clever protocols that sit on top of the blockchain that still use the blockchain and that still kind of inherit things like the security guarantees of a blockchain, but at the same time, a lot of things are done off-chain, and so you get more scalability that way. So in Ethereum, the most popular paradigm for layer 2 is rollups, and the most popular paradigm for layer 1 is sharding.
So one way to achieve layer 1 scaling is to increase the block size.
Yes.
Hence the block size wars, quote unquote. And you actually tweeted something about people are saying that Vitalik changed his mind about he went from being a small
No, it went
blocker
from
to
being big to small,
is it big to
according to
small,
them.
and but you said I've been a medium
Hmm.
blocker all along. So maybe you can also comment on on the very basic aspect before we even get to sharding of where you
Sure.
stand on this block size debate.
Sure. So the way that I think about the trade-off is I think about it as a trade-off between making it easy to write to the blockchain and making it easy to read the blockchain. Right. So when I say read, I just mean, have a node and actually verify it and make sure that it's correct and all of those things. And then by write, I mean send transactions. So I think for decentralization, it's important for both of these tasks to be accessible. And I think that they're like about equally important, right? If you have a chain that's too expensive to read, then everyone will just trust a few people to read for them, and then those people can change the rules without anyone else's permission. But if, on the other hand, it becomes really expensive to write, then everyone will move on to basically second layer systems that are incredibly centralized, and like that takes away from decentralization and self sovereignty as well. So this has been my viewpoints like pretty much the whole time, right? It's that you need this balance, and going in one direction or the other direction is very unhealthy. In the Bitcoin case, basically what happened was that Bitcoin originally, like at the very beginning, it didn't really have a block size. It just had an accidental block size of 32 or a block size limit of 32 megabytes because that just happens to be the limit of the peer-to-peer messages. But then,
interesting. I didn't even know that part.
yeah, but then
interesting.
Satoshi back in 2010 was worried that even 32 megabyte blocks would be too hard to process, so he put the limit down to 1 megabyte. And I think
By put, you mean sneaked in there.
Yeah, just like made an update to the Bitcoin software that made blocks bigger than one. I think it's 1 million bytes invalid. And I think the impression that most people had at the time is that this is just a temporary safety measure, and over time, as we become more confident in the software, that limit would be and like raised somewhat. But back then, when the actual usage of the blockchain started going up, and then it started going up first to 100 kilobytes per block, then to 250 kilobytes per block, then to 500 kilobytes per block. There started kind of coming out of the woodworks this opinion that like, no, that limit should just not be increased. And then there are all of these attempts at compromising, right? First there was like a proposal for 20 megabyte blocks. Then there was the 248 proposal, which is a bit ironic because the 248 proposal started off being like a small block negotiating position. But then when the big block people came back and said like, hey, aren't we going to do this? They're like, oh, no, we don't want the block size increases anymore. So there were these two different positions, right? The small blockers, I think they valued 1 megabyte blocks for two reasons. One is that they just like really, really believe in the importance of being able to read the chain. But two is that a lot of them really believe in maintaining this norm of never hard forking, right? So the difference between a hard fork and a soft fork is basically that in a soft fork, blocks that were any block that's valid under the new rules was still valid under the old rules. So if you have a client that verifies according to the old rules, then you'll still be able to accept the chain that follows the new rules. Whereas with a hard fork, like you have to update your code in order to stay on the chain. And look, they have this belief that soft forks are kind of either less coercive than hard forks, which, by the way, I completely disagree with. I actually think soft forks are more coercive because, like, basically they force everyone who disagrees to sort of go along by default. Or they have this opinion that there's like, it's more difficult to abuse soft forks to do really mean things or that like completely violate people's expectations, like increasing the supply, which is like, I think there is some truth to that. So because of, these reasons, they just say we're only going to do soft forks and we want to just not do any hard forks. And they eventually discovered this idea called segregated witness that allows for like a very tiny block size increase to like the equivalent of about 2 megabytes with a soft fork. It's just a really like weird and devious trick. Like basically what they do is they take the signatures of transactions and then they put them outside of the block, and then they add an extra rule that says that like for a block to be valid, the block has to come with a separate like basically extension block that contains all of the transaction signatures. right? So, when you measure it according to the old rules, like, hey, it adds up to less than 1 million, but actually there's this extension block that the old protocol doesn't even know about. So
It's a hack that seemed to work to in a small way extend the size
exactly.
of the block size.
But so, small block side was like happy with these very low levels of block size, and then the big block side wanted to expand to, at the very least go to 4 megabytes, then maybe 8, 20. There's disagreements within there as well. I definitely was favoring the big side the whole way through, as you can probably tell. But
Even though, so the argument against the big is that it makes things more centralized.
yes, because fewer people can run a node that verifies
Yes.
the chain, and also because any of these things would require a hard fork, and hard forks are inherently risky.
Do you think there's truth to that?
I'm pro hard fork. I think hard forks are actually, like, in a political economic sense, they're better than soft forks.
Well, let's okay. I think that's a beautiful principle, as stated, that soft forks may be more coercive than hard forks.
Mm-hmm.
This is not just about cryptocurrency. This is about politics and life.
Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating. So you're okay with hard forks. In fact, you think hard forks is the right way to make changes because then everybody's forced to make a decision.
Right.
Do you accept this change or not, as opposed to ideas being sneaked in behind the door and and the decision is forced on you?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So, but hard forks, some people say, this is when they talk about sort of Ethereum, is there's some aspect to a hard fork where you're trying to upgrade a, airplane while it's flying. And
I think soft forks are also upgrading an airplane while it's flying.
But it's a smaller upgrades.
That's there's some truth to that. There's definitely a bit more risk of like a split as a result of a hard fork than as a result of a soft fork.
And this split is highly undesirable, right?
Well, it depends. Like, if it's a split because of a bug, then that's horrible. If it's a split as a result of political differences, then I think like a split is better than one side being forced to basically just like suck it up and accept the majority position, even if it really hates it.
Well, there's also political connections throughout the history of the United States. It's like sometimes groups of people that strongly disagree with each other should be forced to work it out, even when a split seems like an easy thing in the short term.
It depends. And I think, for blockchains in particular, the costs of people being able to like peacefully go off and do their own thing are much lower, right? Like, okay, if you have a country and you have two groups, then like often enough, like fighting out the new rules requires, a civil war, requires everyone to move and so forth. But no, on a blockchain, like, the costs are lower. And so.
So if you were to look at the way things worked out with the block size wars, and there was a split, what is it, Bitcoin Cash and
Bitcoin?
Would you, like, putting on your historian hat, you mentioned offline you like Dan Carlin. So if Dan Carlin were to do an episode on the on the block size wars, do you think it could have turned out better, or do you are you okay with the way it turned out?
I'm definitely disappointed with what happened with the big block side. I think the source of my disappointment is that, like, one of the things that you notice when just looking at like these political disagreements generally, especially when you have environments where they're authoritarian or like single party dominated, and then there's some opposition party, and the opposition often has like very legitimate grievances, but at the same time, the thing you notice is that often enough the opposition just sucks, right? Like, it just doesn't have political capacity. It doesn't have like the ability to come up with policy, because its entire culture is like designed around resisting much more than it's designed around like actually debating serious policy trade-offs. And I worry, or I guess not so much worry because it's already happened. I unfortunately think that Bitcoin Cash ended up being a victim of this, right? Like, first, there was the split with Bitcoin Cash, and then, of course, Craig Wright came in, and Craig Wright was this basically scammer who just keeps on pretending that he is Satoshi Nakamoto, the inventor of Bitcoin. Hey, Craig Wright's legal team, do you hear me? Yes, I still think your client is a scammer, so sue me.
This is definitely going to be depth first search, because I got to ask you about Craig. Because there's people have been contacting me, and I'm trying to figure out like what is up with this human being. So for people who don't know, there's somebody who is. Let's start. There's Satoshi Nakamoto, who is the creator of Bitcoin, who's anonymous, and actually most really big people in the cryptocurrency space do not like yourself and others do not dare claim that they are even for fun Satoshi Nakamoto. In fact, if Satoshi Nakamoto is still alive and is like, if say you were Satoshi Nakamoto, it seems like the thing he would do is probably, or she is try to remain anonymous. On the flip side of that, there's a guy named Craig Wright who continually keeps claiming that he is in fact Satoshi Nakamoto and keeps suing a lot of people. So on him, if we could just linger on him, what do you make of this character? What are we supposed to make of this character? Should he be ignored? Is there any possible truth to his claims? What do you make of him?
The analogy that's at the top of my head will get a bit political, but
Oh boy.
that's fine. You've had Michael Malice. So I guess I view Craig Wright as being kind of like a Donald Trump figure.
Yes.
In that, like, he's not very intellectual, but I think he gets a big audience because he says things that like play to the resentments that people have, and he says things that people want to hear. Right, like in the wake of this block size war, the big blockers did feel very disenchanted. Like they felt that Bitcoin always had this vision that we were supposed to just keep increasing the block size, and Bitcoin is peer-to-peer cash. It says so in the white paper. And then this elitist clique of core devs just like came in and said, no, we're going to impose this totally different vision. And if you ever want your scalability, you'll have to wait for us to create this totally unproven fancy technology called the Lightning Network that works under completely different principles. And they were very angry at this, and I mean, I think a lot of that anger is justified. But at the same time, when people are in that mental state, like it's very easy for you to just kind of like latch on. And if you find someone who expresses anger at the same things that you're angry at, and also like it seems like someone who's strong and seems like someone who might be good to rally around, it's very easy to just like get behind that.
But that extra part about where he's Satoshi Nakamoto, I don't understand why that's necessary.
I think that's he could have done it without that, but that just, it's a marketing strategy. Like it sort of gives him more salience. Like there's other big block personalities, right? Well, what's the difference between with Craig Wright? He's not just a big block personality. He's potentially Satoshi, and he did say all the big block things, right? Like he talked about how, the concept of a fee market is fundamentally like economically wrong, and it should be a free market, and you should be able to have blocks as big as you want. Like he repeated all the talking points, and so a lot of people were kind of sucked into that, right? And so he unfortunately was able to basically dominate a big part of the Bitcoin Cash community for a long time, and then eventually, of course, more and more people started to catch on. He would just say technical things that are completely wrong, right? Like one example of this that I remember is that he mixed up the concept of 256 bits and 2 to the power of 256 bits, right? So, the difference is, it's like the difference between, 80 and the concept of 80-digit numbers, right? And because of this, like he made this argument that said that Bitcoin's elliptic curve is friendly to cryptographic pairings. Like you don't have to understand what that is, but if you want to know, I have articles on both at vitalik.ca. But basically, he made this like technical argument that really hinged on this point, and then when people pressed him on it, it's like, yes, what? No, like what? Look, exactly. The height is like what, 2 to the 256 bits. That's a very tiny amount of information. No. 2 to the 256 bits is more than the amount of information in the universe. And like he, equivocated and kind of like preyed on people's inability to understand that mathematical nuance. And I called him out, and eventually I even called him out in person at this conference in Seoul. Like I just stood up and asked the hey, conference organizer, why are you letting this fraud speak at this conference? Yes. And I remember even some big blockers at the time getting angry at me. But eventually they did get rid of him, and then basically Craig Wright was forced to split off because the rest of the community refused to accept some network change that he wanted. And so then there was the BCH and BSV. And then in the Bitcoin Cash community, there was this drama of, are they going to add a developer fund where they redirect 12.5% of the revenue from the miners to the devs? And according to the libertarian non-aggression principle, is this technically theft? And,
like his understanding of the technical depths of cryptocurrency was lacking in a way that Satoshi Nakamoto certainly would not.
Yes, exactly. But the point is that even after Craig Wright got expunged, the Bitcoin Cash community kept having these disagreements, right? And now, after this development funds dispute, there was a further split between Bitcoin Cash and ABC. And so, the branching tree continues to extend, right? So
in that way, it's disappointing to see those kinds of splitting. That was never resolved.
It is. I would have definitely wanted to see more of a kind of principled coin with that tries to be Bitcoin, but follows consistent big block values. But I don't know, maybe I should just stop expecting projects that I have no involvement in to care at all about what my values are, and maybe Ethereum just is.
It just is. Yeah. Nevertheless, I think you have a powerful voice, and you can inspire other projects to do to live up to their best possible selves. Okay, so that's the level. That's the layer one approach. The other layer one within Ethereum is the idea of sharding.
Yes. What
the heck is sharding?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
What does the future of sharding look like?
Right. So to summarize that big, long tangent that we just went
It's a beautiful tangent, by the way.
Yeah, it's an amazing tangent. And I think crypto is just one of the most underrated aspects of crypto is, I think, how you can analyze the, the sociology and the politics and the anthropology. And and I'm sure Dan Carlin would have fun exploring the space at some point. But the core trade-off, right, is that if you scale blockchains the dumb way just by increasing the parameters, then eventually you just make it harder and harder to participate as a node, and you end up with a system where there's 20 computers running the whole thing, and it's just very centralized. So sharding basically says, well, instead of just increasing the parameters, what we're going to do is we're going to change the blockchain architecture in such a way that each individual node in the blockchain only needs to store a small portion of the data and only needs to process a small portion of the transactions. So you can think about it as being inspired by BitTorrent, right? On BitTorrent, there's no such thing as a BitTorrent full node that has every movie, right? The work is split up among a huge number of computers, and that makes sense. That's the only sane way to scale a system like that. And if they actually tried making a version of BitTorrent that required full nodes that store every movie, then it would have zero censorship resistance, and it would just be dead in an instant. So the challenge with taking that model and applying it to blockchains, right, is that blockchains aren't just about spreading data around. They're about agreeing on exactly what data was spread around and ensuring that everything that you agree on actually is correct. Mm-hmm. And so you have this paradox where, let's say you want to have a system that supports 10,000 transactions a second, but each computer in the network can only personally verify 100 transactions a second. So how can each computer get a guarantee about the other 9,900 without actually going and verifying them themselves?
Yep.
And it turns out that there are some a bundle of different tricks that can do that, right? So one of them is just random sampling. So the idea behind random sampling is let's say for simplicity, this is a proof of stake chain, and you have 10,000 validators. Validators are the stakers. And for simplicity, we'll assume they all have the same number of coins, right? If someone has more coins, we'll just kind of split them up and pretend they're 10 stakers. Then you do some random shuffling, and you basically say these random 100 validators are assigned to validate this block. These random 100 validators are assigned to validate this block. These random 100 validators are assigned to validate this block. And so each individual computer only gets assigned to validate a small piece. But then the way that the information about what's valid gets passed around, right, is that when these 100 participants validate a block, they all sign a message basically saying yes, we agree that this block is valid. And then they combine that signature into one, and then they broadcast that signature. And then everyone else, instead of verifying the blocks directly, just verifies that signature, right? And so if I see the signature, I'm not directly convinced that that block is valid, but what I am convinced of is that out of this committee of, or this randomly selected group of 100 validators, let's say at least 70 of them agree that this block is valid. And so if I trust that, the majority of these participants are all honest, then because it's all randomly selected, the attacker can't just like force themselves into one committee. And so, the attacker is going to be evenly spread out too. And so if, the entire set of validators is mostly honest, every committee is going to be mostly honest. And so like bad blocks are not going to go through, right? So that's like one simple form of sharding. There's also other more clever things that you can do. So for example, there's this concept of ZK snarks, right? I'll call it zero knowledge proofs. So this is the idea that you can make a cryptographic proof that says, I verified or I ran some complex computation on this piece of data and I got this answer. And so if you make these kinds of proofs, then like if you see a ZK snark that says some block is valid, then you're convinced that that block is valid. And even if, everyone in that committee is evil, like they have no way of making a valid proof for a bad block. Right? Like because the proof itself, like it is a proof that you did the computation, where that proof is much easier to verify than just running the computation yourself. And, there's once again, super awesome mathematical cryptographic magic behind making ZK snarks work.
So it gives you a little bit of a leg up over the 51% honest assumption. So it's a little hack that improves upon the random sampling thing.
Exactly. And like there's other hacks, right? Like there is another hack called data availability sampling that allows you to make sure that the data in the blocks was actually published. But like basically, like if you stack a couple of these tricks on top of each other, you can create a system where like I, as an individual participant, can be convinced that everything that's going on in this distributed blockchain thing is correct without actually personally checking more than like 1% of it. So that's sharding.
That's sharding. But as I understand, maybe correct me on this, is in the space of Ethereum, the sharding happens on some fixed number. Like the split is on some fixed number. I think it's 64 is the currently sort of proposed number. So how does that help scaling? Is it just a fixed constant scaling by 64? And is that a way to achieve the crazy amount of scaling that seems to be required to use cryptocurrency for purchasing? So doing like competing with credit cards and Visa and so on.
Right. So first, I think like the 64 can be hard forked up over time. So we've set it so that like there's theoretically space in the data structure for 1,024 shards. It's just that 64 of them are turned on. Like there are challenges with having more shards because like you have to have logic that just like checks and manages all of those shards. And if there's too many of them, then that becomes too expensive. But even still, you can improve quite a bit. And then the other thing that we're doing is if like we're getting maximum scalability by combining rollups and sharding. Right. So this might be a good time to talk about rollups.
What are rollups?
Okay.
And now we're moving into layer 2 ideas.
Yes. So the idea behind a rollup is basically that. So instead of just publishing transactions directly on chain and having everyone, do all of the checking of those transactions. What you do is you create a system where users send their transactions to some central party called an aggregator. And theoretically you can have a system where like the aggregator switches around or anyone can be an aggregator. So, it's still like permissionless to send things. Then what the aggregator does is they strip out all of the transaction data that like is not relevant to helping people update the state. So when I say the state, this is a very important kind of technical term for blockchains. I mean like account balances, code, like things that are like internal memory of smart contracts. So like basically everything the blockchain actually has to keep track of and remember, right? So you just put in you take all these transactions, strip out all the data that's not relevant to telling people how to update the state. And then you take the data that's needed to update the state and then you like really compress it, right? So like, for example, if we say, I, Vitalik, have an account that's 0xAB58, blah, 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 and it's 20 bytes, well, instead we can say, well, I have an account that is number 1874224 in the tree, right?
Mhm.
And that goes down from 20 bytes to just like an index and a position, which is 3 bytes, right? So you use all sorts of these fancy compression tricks, and you basically just, instead of publishing all these transactions, you publish this like tiny compressed blob, right? So the amount of data that goes on chain goes down by maybe about a factor of 10, right? And then the second thing is that you don't do the computation on chain. Instead, you do the computation off chain, and there's one of two ways to do this, right? One is called a ZK rollup, which is you just provide a ZK snark that basically says, "Hey, look, I did this computation, and I have this proof that here's the some hash of the result, and it's correct." And then you stick it on chain, and everyone verifies this one proof instead of verifying all these transactions. And then the other approach is called an optimistic rollup, which is basically made of this scheme where, like, first someone says, like, "Hey, this is what I think the result of applying these transactions is," and then someone else can say, "I disagree. The result is different." And only if two people disagree do you actually do it on. Do you actually just like publish all of the data and run the whole that whole block on chain. So if there's disagreements, then you just like run everything on chain, and whoever was wrong like loses a lot of money, right? So like disagreements are very rare and they're very expensive. And in a ZK rollup, you don't even rely on this like challenging game at all. You just rely on a proof. So the core principle is basically that instead of lots of transactions and all the everyone verifies every transaction, it is you take the transactions, you strip them down and compress them as much as possible, then stick that on the blockchain. You do need to stick something on the blockchain just so that everyone else can like keep up to date with the state, so they know what all the contracts are, what all the balances are, and all of this. But it's a very small amount of data, and then you use one of these other off-chain games. Could be this optimistic game, could be a ZK snark, to just prove that somebody out there did the computation and the result is correct, right? So you're pushing like 90% of the work off-chain, and then 90% of the data and 99% of the computation off-chain, and then you still have 10% of the data and 1% of the computation on-chain, and so your scalability goes up by a factor of about 100. So these systems are already live for some applications, right? So there's something called loopring, which is just a ZK rollup for payments, right? So you can have assets inside of the loopring system, and you can go around and transfer them, but and you get like much lower transaction fees, right? Like instead of $5, you'd have to pay like less than 5 cents. But the only problem is that this only supports a couple of applications right now. Like making one that supports anything that you can do on Ethereum just takes a bit more work, but that's being done as well, right? So like within a few months, I'm expecting, fully Ethereum capable rollups to be available as well. So rollups, just summarizing, do most of the work off chain, put only a little bit on chain, factor of 100 scaling, sharding, another factor of 100 scaling, 100 times 100, factor of 10,000, hundreds of thousands of transactions a second, and there's your scalability.
Okay, so you achieve scalability, you can do a large number of transactions very quickly, and the cost of doing those transactions is much lower. You wrote that in the long term, ZK rollups are going to win in terms of layer 2 technology. Specifically, you wrote, in general, my own view is that in the short term, optimistic rollups, as you were saying, are likely to win out of general purpose EVM computation, and ZK rollups are likely to win out for simple payments, exchange, and other application-specific use cases, just as you were saying. But in the medium to long term, ZK rollups will win out in all use cases as ZK snark technology improves. Why do you think ZK rollups are going to win the big picture battle over layer 2 technologies?
So I think ZK rollups, like once you accept that the technology works, are just like conceptually simpler and they have nicer properties. The reason is that they do not have this concept of a challenge game, right? Like as I mentioned, in an optimistic rollup, the way that you ensure that the results are correct is that you let one person submit, and like they just submit with no proof. They just say, here's what I think the result is. And then if someone else disagrees, they make their own submission. And then if you have two disagreeing submissions, then you actually publish it on chain and you see who's right. right? But for this to work, like you need to actually wait for someone to disagree, right? So like, for example, if I have an asset inside of an optimistic rollup and I want to withdraw it, then I actually have to wait a week to withdraw it, because like if the a block that contains my withdrawal turned out to be invalid, then there needs to be space for someone to disagree with it, right? Whereas with a ZK rollup, like you don't need time for disagreement because you just have a proof, right? As soon as a block is submitted, there's a proof, and it's correct.
So if disagreements, especially in the long term, are sparse, then you don't want to do the optimistic, the game theoretic thing. You want to do the ZK snark.
Right. The ZK stuff is just like you can in a ZK rollup you can withdraw immediately. You don't have to like worry about the economics of proving as much. Right. There's just like fewer issues. The reason why ZK rollups are not winning everywhere today is because ZK snarks is still a crazy new technology, right? Like this is something that 10 years ago, it existed only in theory and there was none in practice. Then 8 years ago, people were just getting excited about it in Bitcoin conferences for the first time. Starting 4 years ago, or 3.5 years ago even, that was the first time you were able to make any ZK snark based anything on Ethereum. And then people started making them, and ZK technology has only really become efficient enough to do a lot of things within the past maybe 1.5 years. So it's new technology, it's crazy technology, it's admittedly scary technology. If you want to learn more, I also have an article about this on vitalik.ca.
It's actually really, really good. Most of your writing, it's technical, but it's accessible. I highly, highly recommend to check out Vitalik's articles and blogs, whatever you call them.
Yeah,
on your website. It's brilliant summary of the work. Actually, Ethereum documentation period is really good. I think that's somewhat crowdsourced. That documentation is really, really accessible and brilliant. But let me ask about sort of other approaches to layer 2, like side chains. So the one popular one is Polygon. What are your thoughts about Polygon, which is a layer 2 network? Is it positive? Is it negative for Ethereum? Is it both? Does it have a future, which is its own chain, but it's using Ethereum? It's like based on Ethereum essentially. Or maybe you can describe what it is.
Yeah. So I think there's a really big and important difference in security models between rollups and sidechains, which is basically that rollups inherit from the security of Ethereum, right? Yes. So like if I have coins inside of Loopring or Optimism or Arbitrum or ZK Sync, then even if everyone else in the world who is participating in these ecosystems like hates me and wants to steal my money, I can still personally make sure that no matter what happens, I get my money out. It might be a bit expensive for me to get my money out, and I have to do transactions like on the main chain, but I'll be able to do it. Whereas in Polygon, which is a side chain, and so instead of being secured by Ethereum, it's also in part secured by its own proof of stake consensus with its own token. So if 70% of the whole, or even 51% of the holders of Polygon tokens wanted to take my money in Polygon, they can, right? So that's and like, to be fair, like there aren't even like the supply, I don't think is even that widely distributed, right? So like potentially you could this